Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Pam, and welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Now, Joe, in addition to being a radio host, a tax expert, and all of the other things you're also a practicing psychologist, and you're a digital mental health guy as well. I did not realize until I started looking into this that you, in addition to your practice, are involved in something called the Center for M-Squared Health. And then I tried to figure out, like, M-Squared, was that like M&M's or Marilyn Manson? And it turns out, no, I think it means mobile mental. Am I right about that?
That's absolutely right, Pam.
So tell us a little bit about it.
Well, Pam, most people are never going to go to a therapist. It's too much, and frankly, they don't want to. But everybody's got some problems. And the great attraction to digital mental health that you could get on your PC or even better yet on your phone is that it's always there at your convenience and it's infinitely scalable. So if we get the right program for anxiety or depression, Joe Ruzek is going to talk about PTSD, we might be able to treat 1 million people.
Yeah, but one of the things, I teach this in my first-year torts class, is there's a very famous case that involves a psychiatrist in California who didn't warn somebody that his patient was going to kill her, and she did, and there's a famous case about this. And so mental health raises a lot of legal issues, and today we have 3 folks with us, in addition to you, who's our special permanent guest in that sense, that we're going to be talking to about mental health issues. We'll be joined later in the show by Alison Darcy, who's a lecturer in psychiatry and behavioral sciences here at Stanford and the CEO and founder of a mental health app called Woebot. I guess it's for people who are unhappy. They call it your charming robot friend who's ready to listen. And how much better than most people we know is that? And here in the studio, we're joined by Zach Harned, who's a Stanford Law School student and also doing graduate work in symbolic systems. He is an expert in psychology as well and is president of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence and Law Society and a senior fellow with Brainstorm. And then we're joined by Joe Ruzek, who ran the Veterans Administration's Training Center for PTSD and is a leader in digital mental health. So we're so glad you're here with us. And Joe, take it from there.
Well, I'm going to first of all welcome my old friend, Joe, the other Joe. And Joe, you and I have worked together for years on digital mental health. Start us off. Did I say it right to give the pitch for why we think it's so important?
Yeah, I think the overarching reason is the one you said. We could reach a lot of people who might not be willing to come in and see a shrink or come in for mental health care in any way. But I also will argue that the digital technologies we have now could make traditional face-to-face care more effective by getting outside of the office and reaching into the life of the person.
It's a great point, Joe, and we'll talk about some of those. But to jump in, let's talk about something you did at the VA. Name a mental health app coach or app. I'm giving away the name of it, and tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I think we saw the possibility that you've just shared, and that is the ability to reach many veterans with PTSD. Lots of veterans come into the VA for care, but there are many out in the community. So we thought, let's build something. So the first thing we did was something called PTSD Coach, which is a kind of educational and coping tool for veterans in managing their PTSD and any time they're distressed. And that really took off. It's been downloaded more than 400,000 times in 96 countries now. So there's a real interest in getting these kinds of tools to people.
And so can I just ask, what would it look like from the user's point of view? So the person downloads the app, and then what happens?
They go into it, very simple to use. They can, first of all, assess their own levels of PTSD. There's a validated questionnaire, 17 items. They answer it. It will give them individualized feedback about where they stand in terms of the seriousness of any difficulties they might have. And they also have the option of asking it to come on back and continue to assess it so they can see how their PTSD symptoms may shift over time. But there's also a learn psychoeducational function on there. It teaches them things they need to learn. There's a coping skills tool which helps them cope in different ways. And there's a social support function of linking them with various kinds of social support and helping services.
And Joe, I know one of the things you're working now is to expand something like that for everyone.
Yeah.
And this is going to be called eCourage, I think. And who else would get it?
Well, we've been thinking about the context here in our conversation of the United States and mental health care for people with PTSD and other mental health problems. But I think where there's a gigantic opportunity is globally. You know, the burden of mental health globally far exceeds the life burden of most physical health conditions. There are hundreds of millions of people around the world, especially in low-income countries, who experience tremendous adversity, are depressed, and have difficult lives. As we all know, phones are becoming ubiquitous, and it's thought that most people in the world will actually have a smartphone in about 10 years from now. So we could help literally millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people manage their daily stresses and their problems.
It's really fantastic. I find it thrilling when you talk about this, Joe. We know some of these work because we've done studies on many of these programs. Let's talk about the problems of them not working. Why isn't this just a panacea? Why don't we close up shop? We being people that, like me, that see clients one-on-one.
Well, I don't think there's going to be a threat to our industries in the West of helping people for a very simple reason. That is, you know, if you ever make a New Year's resolution, it's tough to get yourself to follow through with it, even though you know it's a good idea. Using phones are no different. Phones require a person to go onto them, use them regularly, pull them out when they're worried. So typically in the field of technology research, it's a consistent finding has been that unguided self-help, when you simply fling a technology at somebody, works much less well than guided self-help, where there's some kind of human coaching or encouragement, because people simply drop out of using the tool. They don't use it enough to get the therapeutic dose.
And when you talk about the kind of therapeutic dose, that raises the question that I had thought that one of the big changes in modern mental health had been the move away from the talking cures to the pharmacological cures. And now you're going back to something that's much more like a talking cure in a way.
Absolutely. I'm not one of the devotees of the biological model of all this stuff and solving it with little pills or brain stimulation, although that may be valuable. The most effective psychotherapies for problems, and indeed for simpler things like stress management, are in fact talking cures and teaching people skills for managing their own lives differently. And I think what the phones do is it puts a very valuable coping tool for how they can manage and understand and do things about their own problems in living.
Well, you know, we're going to talk more about what you're doing and more about the problems, and we're certainly going to focus on the legal issues. But I thought from the VA it might be nice to change it up a little bit and have our listeners and viewers hear from a recent Stanford startup. So I think after a short message about our station, we'll do just that.
So this is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking about digital mental health, and we've been talking with Joe Ruzek, who ran the VA mental health mobile app. So we'll put on our headsets, and we're going to talk, as I mentioned earlier in the show, to Alison about Woebot.
And Alison, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. And tell us a little bit about this charming robot who's going to listen to you.
Well, Woebot is an emotional assistant that delivers a sort of a DIY version of cognitive behavioral therapy through short daily conversations that are text-based. So just as Joe was just saying there, we know that a guided self-help version is of certain approaches to therapy are more effective than just pure self-help. And so Woebot is like a guide, but an automated guide, which is really sort of new for this field.
So how does cognitive behavioral therapy actually work?
Well, CBT, as it's known for short, is really based on the idea that our thoughts create our moods rather than the other way around. And so CBT teaches people how to first externalize negative thoughts. Second, identify distortions therein. And then third, asks people to restructure or rewrite the thought over and over again, until such time that people actually start to feel better as they challenge their own negative assumptions that they've always thought were true up until that point.
So which kinds of negative assumptions does Woebot help people get over?
Well, it's interesting because, according to the original theory, there are really specific distortions that are associated with, the type of mood. So, for example, people who feel anxious will almost always be oriented around the future. What if I make a fool of myself? What if I, do a really terrible job? I'm going to fall off this ledge. So you can sort of detect it in language. Whereas, people with something like depression might have a lot of all or nothing thinking. I'm a total loser. Things are never going to change. And so they're quite identifiable. And there's a group of about 10 to 12 that CBT thinks about a lot. And so Woebot really just guides people through that process of identifying distortions and then invites them to restructure the thought. And that's the really powerful moment that we want to encourage people to do as much as possible. And we know actually predicts better outcomes the more they do that.
So I asked Joe this question earlier, and I want to ask you the question as well, which is just walk me through, if you were a user of Woebot and you're one of those people who says, I am totally worthless, I always screw up, I never get things right. What does Woebot say to you?
Right, so I think what Woebot will do is every day kind of checks in with you like a text from a friend and just says, hey, how's your day going? And if you are feeling badly in that moment, Woebot will invite you to see if you want to challenge your thinking, if you want help with that moment. And if you do, Woebot will ask, what's the situation? And he tries to get a handle on what's the nature of the problem this person is dealing with, whether it's a relationship problem. Are they worried about making their rent? Is it something going on at work? And then based on his understanding of the problem, will guide the user through a kind of the appropriate technique that's, drawing from the full repertoire of techniques that we have from both cognitive behavioral therapy and also some from dialectical behavior therapy and interpersonal therapy as well. And it's just a very step-by-step, sort of respectful, slow process that ultimately ends in about 3/4 of people feeling better at that level of that single conversation.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking about digital mental health. We were just talking with Alison Darcy, and we've also been talking with Joe Ruzek.
Alison, I'm wondering if the kinds of things Woebot says, and here it's a little bit of a disingenuous question because I subscribe to Woebot and I've used it enough to get a sense of what it does. And
You are not totally worthless, Joe.
That's what my charming robot friend says too, Pam. So thank you. And Woebot's quite believable. It's quite charming. It is AI-based. But I'm guessing what it would do for Pam's question is ask her to challenge some of her statements. Is there another? Do you think you're really totally worthless? Is there any evidence that you could cite in the alternative?
Yeah, I wonder also, are there people for whom, this goes back to where you introduced us, Joe Bankman and Joe Ruzek, I'd love to hear from you on this as well. Are there people for whom their interpersonal skills are sufficiently weak or their relationship to others is sufficiently problematic that it's actually better to be dealing with a disembodied voice than with a human therapist?
Well, I'll take a quick crack of that and maybe listen to Alison's thoughts too. But certainly a potential advantage for some people in technology is that they don't have to talk to the person, so the embarrassment factor is not there. So there's some evidence that sometimes people are more honest and more open with a machine than they are with a person. And most of what's offered on these technologies is pretty basic. It's a first level of self-care, so it has low potential, I think, in most cases for harm, and therefore can be stepped up and added to with human support if it's needed.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are some studies that have looked at this empirically, and we know that for the most part, people find it easier to share and disclose things to an AI than a human. And so that actually runs across all people. In our early conversations with young people, we would always ask this question to both, young women and young men, whether there was anything that they would be afraid to share with another person. And it was really interesting, certainly skewed towards males being much more inhibited in that way, and would commonly say, yeah, of course, there's lots of things I would never share with someone else. And so what we're trying to do with Woebot is reduce that friction towards somebody being able to get something off their chest, because what we've noticed is when they do, it's ultimately like practice. It is their first experience of externalizing something that has been really internal before, and we think that sort of encourages people to then subsequently share with other humans.
Yeah, that's one of the things that kind of interested me, was whether Woebot or the program that you ran, Joe, turned out to be a sort of gateway drug to people realizing that maybe they really would benefit from some serious therapy with a human therapist.
We've built into most of our apps and some of the web programs that we've used guidance for people in thinking about, helping them to determine whether they might wish to seek professional care. And one of the things we can do with these apps is educate them and sort of make it less frightening to go for care by helping people understand what really goes on there, which really is not frightening and is highly practical. So we do see it as a gateway of referral to care. And just quickly to say also, the PTSD Coach app, if a person's in great distress, takes steps to link them with the National Suicide Counseling Hotline. So in fact can quickly refer people for emergency care.
You know, I know that our time is going to be limited with you, Alison, in particular. So that was such a great answer. I'm going to ask you a different question, Alison, and it is one I think you're going to like. I think our listeners and viewers would get a kick out of having Woebot advise them. So, how would they get it? And how much does it cost?
Well, currently it is free, and they just download it from the app stores. It's with both iOS and Android right now.
Well, that's great. And we'll be back with more from our guests talking about mental health and mobile mental health and digital mental health next on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121. Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Carlin, along with Joe Bankman.
Pam, one of the great things about teaching at Stanford Law School is the students we come in contact with. And today's guest, Zach Harned, is an example of just how lucky we are. Zach comes to us with a background in clinical psychology. He knows some AI, knows CS at least better than I ever will. He's worked a little bit in the digital mental health industry, including a little bit with Alison. He's been an RA of mine, but I really regard him as a peer. It's such a fast-moving world in the law governing digital AI that if you asked me who's the expert, I might refer you to Zach.
Well, we're so lucky to have you on the show, Zach. And we're lucky to have you at Stanford. I mean, I'm starting to feel a little bit like Lou Gehrig. I feel like I'm the luckiest man on earth, although I'm not a man and I'm not dying. So I feel luckier, actually luckier. So one of the things that we know is that the law interacts in all sorts of ways with mental health issues, ranging from the insanity defense to the duty of doctors to disclose threats from their patients and everything. And this brave new world of digital mental health is going to raise a lot of issues like this. So, what happens if somebody says to Woebot, I'm feeling totally worthless? I mean, we heard Alison say, it's people saying, I feel totally worthless. There's nothing good about me. I'm going to end it all. What would a regular mental health professional be obligated to do under those circumstances?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and thanks so much for having me on the show. And this is something that's not particular to Woebot. Large platforms are now having to consider this as a content moderation issue or a variety of other sort of mental health apps. As a, sort of licensed professional, normally you have a number of obligations depending on the severity. But one of the things that's often not commonly known is that there's a number of gradations of suicidal intent and ideation, and oftentimes sort of leaping to the most extreme reaction, of saying, oh, we need to hospitalize this person or something like that. can be deleterious, as there's often a area or sort of arena of normal kind of, instances of suicidal ideation in which exploration or further discussion or things like that are actually what would be most advantageous. And so if we have that reflected in individuals, maybe we want these sort of online programs to do it as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, Joe, that you said earlier in our discussion was that your app was set up so that if somebody made suicidal comments, it would prompt them or contact the National Suicide Hotline or the like. I mean, is that something that can be built into these apps?
I think that a lot can be done. Interestingly, in the large healthcare systems where we've done our work, decision was taken to actually not gather this data. So in other words, there would be no responsibility for a healthcare professional to notify anyone because, in fact, they are not seeing that response. So PTSD Coach, which I mentioned, has been pretty much a psychoeducational tool. Yes, if a person's in distress, it will make it easy for them to contact help.
Click here if you want to talk to a live.
Exactly. But it's keeping healthcare professionals within that healthcare system from having to be responsible for monitoring and interacting at all times of the day and night.
Right.
And in a sense, Joe, that's a downside of legal liability because, in fact, that's not ideal. We'd want to make it easier to monitor, in part to know how often people have these impulses, how to deal with them. What we really want is really good experience with people having these impulses to get the right response that Zach says, but we don't do it for fear of legal liability. But Zach, Woebot doesn't have that option, I think, because it's interactive. So PTSD Coach doesn't have that same level of interactivity, and it can have a kind of hear no evil, see no scary. Woebot can't do that.
Well, and Woebot, like many other products too, are very upfront in noting that this is not designed to assist with people with high levels of suicidal ideation or severe levels of depression or things like that. But yes, there's still a sort of responsibility issue of when something like this becomes clear, does the program make the appropriate referrals, like Joe had mentioned, to a suicide hotline, which Woebot obviously does in those cases.
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
No.
I don't know. So I was going to actually ask you about something else, which is earlier in the broadcast, again, Joe, you had said one of the things that's great about these digital tools is people who would feel uncomfortable talking to a human being about some embarrassing thing, something maybe they shouldn't even be embarrassed about, but they are, will feel comfortable talking to a digital assistant. But one of the things I would worry about is the way you read about things that people do online now is it's all gathered someplace, and the mosaic theory of information means that they can gather, you talked to Woebot, and then right after that you went to an adult bookstore, and then right after that you did this, and so forth and so on. Is there any kind of obligation on a program like Woebot to keep your data confidential, or is it just whatever contract the makers of the app put on the shrink wrap or the click wrap or whatever it's called now?
This is a really important question for the space in general, not just for Woebot, is how are we going to handle privacy? Because as you noted, with the sort of mosaic theory of information, especially with the advent of machine learning, which has become really good at deducing the intimate from the relatively mundane. If you can get a set of these mundane facts, but then do this fancy analysis on them.
Isn't there something recently, I read something about how people were being notified they were pregnant before they knew they were pregnant because of searches they had done, which tend to indicate that you're, unusually fecund?
Yes, so there's a number of these results, and they're always coming up. That's one of the fascinating ones. Your likelihood of being admitted to an ER also comes from search results. This just came up this week. And even more intimate pieces of your information, the way that you type or swipe on your phone might reveal things about your mood. Certain facial expressions or things might also sort of detail your sentiment analysis and things like that.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Zach Harned and Joe Ruzek about digital mental health. Joe?
Zach, we're talking about, first of all, liability. And one of the interesting things, and I thought I'd just throw this out, is nobody really knows what the liability rules are in digital mental health. So you get some organizations, the VA, that has a kind of a scaredy cat mode. It plays it safe. It just doesn't store the information. You have other startups, and there's a lot of startups in this space, including Woebot. Hey, by the way, if you're trying to find Woebot, it's woe as in troubles, WOEBOT. I don't think there's much law out there, and probably not a lot of cases about people suing when the bad happens. Is that your thought?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And not a lot of cases is putting it generously. I would say probably zero is the number that are out there now. It's a remarkable. There's a remarkable dearth of data on that sort of application now.
And maybe that's good news in a way if you think these things are mostly positive, because it means that we know that suicide is very hard to predict, and that's, I think, what we're all most scared of. But we know there's actually relatively few suits, and we know there's relatively few suits because we'd start seeing some of them. And excuse me, when I talk to people that are in the risk management business, that is, they're insurers or self-insurers like Stanford, I'm getting the same impression. So the good news is people aren't suing. Of course, the first suit could be for $100 million, and then that wouldn't be such good news.
I mean, one of the other things is, in addition, the other area of law on this is regulation. And, if you want to be a clinical psychologist, you have to be licensed, right? I mean, yeah, you can't just put out a shingle, but I assume for these apps, anybody can put out an app, and as long as they can get one or the other app stores to put it on, or they could put it on the web. Is there any regulation of this?
So this is another huge question for the area. The FDA seems to be the primary player at this point that wants to make sure it's producing the correct oversight, because as Joe mentioned, there's tremendous potential for growth and assisting people who are really in need. There's also a lot of potential for abuse and people sort of being injured by inappropriate apps, and so they're one of the main players to look to in this space.
Well, we've been talking here with really three terrific guests. Joe Ruzek, an old colleague of mine, and I say that in the most benign way, Joe, because we're both old. Zach Harned and Alison Darcy about digital mental health. And I have the feeling, Pam, we've really only scratched the surface.
Yes, but to use a therapist line, our time is up. So thank you for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121.
Thank you.